The train was 20 minutes late, and Caleb Hartwell had counted every one of them. He stood at the far end of the platform in Gray Butte, Montana territory, in the good coat he had owned for 9 years and worn maybe 4 times. His hat was new. His boots were not. In his left hand, he held a folded letter, so soft from rereading that the creases had gone furry. And in his right, he held nothing, because he did not know what a man was supposed to hold while he waited for a wife he had never met. 12 years. That was how long he had been saving for this day. 12 years of beans and hard winters and selling the good calves and keeping the poor ones. 12 years of telling himself that a ranch without a woman in the kitchen was just a barn a man happened to sleep in. He was 41. The letter in his hand said her name was Eleanor Frost, that she was 26, that she could cook and read and was not afraid of work, and that she would be wearing a gray traveling dress and a blue ribbon so he would know her. The whistle came first, then the smoke, then the long iron groan of the 410 pulling in, and Caleb's heart went up into his throat like a boy's. People came off the train, a drummer with sample cases, 2 ranch hands, an old woman met by her son, and then a young woman in a gray traveling dress with a blue ribbon at her collar, exactly as the letter promised, stepping down careful onto the platform with one gloved hand on the rail. Caleb took 1 step toward her, and then he stopped, because the gray dress did not lie flat the way a young woman's dress lies flat. It curved. She was carrying 6 months along, maybe 7, the kind of along that no coat can hide and no letter had ever mentioned. She held a small carpet bag against the curve of her belly like a shield, and she looked down the platform at the tall rancher in the new hat, and her face was the face of someone who already knew exactly what he was thinking. She did not run. I have thought about that part more than any other. A woman in her position, in that year, with nowhere to go and no money to get there, and still she lifted her chin and waited to be judged where she stood. The drummer noticed. The 2 ranch hands noticed. The station master, leaning in his doorway, noticed. By supper time, half of Gray Butte would know that Caleb Hartwell's mail-order bride had stepped off the 410 carrying a child that could not possibly be his. She walked toward him because there was nowhere else to walk. She stopped 3 feet away. Up close she was prettier than he had let himself hope, and more tired than any letter could carry. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, not a question. "Miss Frost." "It's Mrs.," she said quietly. "It was Mrs., that's the first thing I lied about, and I expect it won't be the last thing you hold against me. The train back east leaves at 6. If you'll spare me the fare, I'll be on it, and you'll never have to explain me to anyone." And Caleb Hartwell, who had rehearsed 100 kind first words on the long ride into town, found that not one of them would come. To understand why Caleb did not put her on the 6 o'clock train, you have to understand the 12 years. He had come to Montana at 19 with a dead father's watch and $40. The watch he sold the first winter to buy a milk cow, the $40 he never spent, because spending it would have meant admitting he might fail. He filed his claim under the Homestead Act, the law that promised a man 160 acres if he could keep himself alive on it for 5 years. Plenty could not. Caleb did. There is a line people used to say about that whole westward push, attributed to the newspaperman Horace Greeley. "Go west, young man, and grow up with the country." Caleb had gone west. He had grown up. He had grown old, a little, before his time. What he had not done was build a single thing worth coming home to, because there was never anyone in it when he came home. The first years were the cattle, then the second barn, then the good well, dug by hand over 2 summers. That meant he no longer had to haul water in the dry months. By the time he was 35, he had the best small ranch on the east side of the Butte, and a house with a real wood floor, and a stove that a woman back in Ohio had once told him was the finest thing she had ever stood in front of. That woman had not come west with him. That was the part Caleb did not tell people. Her name does not matter now. What matters is that she chose a banker in Columbus, and Caleb told himself it was because he had nothing to offer, and he spent the next decade making sure he would never have nothing again. So he had the ranch. He had the floor and the stove and the well, and every night he sat at a table built for a family and ate alone, and listened to the wind do all the talking. The advertisement he answered was in a matrimonial paper that circulated out of Chicago. Lonely men of the territories wrote in. Hopeful women back east wrote back. It was an ordinary thing in 1883, no stranger than buying a plow by mail. He had written a careful, honest letter. He had said he was not handsome, and not young, and not poor. He had said he wanted a partner, not a servant. He had waited 3 weeks for a reply, and when Eleanor Frost's first letter came, he had read it on the porch in the failing light, and then read it again by lamp, and for the first time in years the wind had not been the only voice in his house. Now she stood on the platform carrying a child, and the 6 o'clock train would take her away forever, and Caleb realized that the thing he could not stand was not the lie. It was the thought of the table being empty again tomorrow. He took her bag. That was the first thing he did. Not a speech, not a judgment. He simply reached out and took the carpet bag from her arms, the way a man takes a heavy thing from anyone, and her arms stayed bent around the shape of it for a second after it was gone. "You'll be hungry," he said. "It's a long ride out. We'll eat at the hotel first, and then we'll talk on the road where the whole town isn't leaning out its windows." She looked at him like she was waiting for the catch. There was no catch. There was only a tall, tired man holding her bag, and a town pretending not to watch. Over a plate of beef and boiled potatoes that she ate too fast, and tried to hide eating too fast, the truth came out in pieces. Her letters had not all been lies. She could cook, she could read, better than he could, it would turn out. She was 26. She was not afraid of work, but she had left out the husband, a clerk named Thomas Frost, who had married her in Baltimore and died of a fever 14 months later, owing money to men who were not gentle about being owed. She had left out that his family blamed her for the debt and the death both. She had left out that she was carrying Thomas's child when she answered Caleb's advertisement, and that she had answered it because a woman alone, and expecting, with creditors at the door, does not have the luxury of being honest about everything at once. "I told myself I'd write you the truth before I came," she said, looking at her plate. "Then a week passed, and another, and the longer I waited, the more impossible it got. By the time I had the courage, the ticket was already bought with the last of what I had. So I wore the loosest dress I owned, and I prayed you'd be a cruel enough man to just send me home, so it would be your choice and not mine." "Why would you pray for that?" "Because if you were kind," she said, "I'd have to live the rest of my life knowing what I cost a kind man." Caleb turned his coffee cup a slow half-circle on the table. Outside, the light was going amber. The 6 o'clock would be boarding in less than an hour. "That child," he said carefully, "it's got a father's name already. Frost. It does. And no father to carry it." "No." He nodded slowly, like a man checking a fence line in his head. "Then here's the only question that matters to me, and I'd ask you not to lie about this one, because I'll know. Did you come out here to use me, Mrs. Frost? Or did you come out here hoping, somewhere under all the fear, that it might actually work?" She was quiet a long time. When she answered the way honest people answer, which is slowly. "I came to survive," she said. "But your letters, Mr. Hartwell. Nobody had written to me like a person in 2 years. I read them so many times I could say them in the dark. I didn't let myself hope. But the hoping happened anyway." He did not put her on the 6 o'clock. He drove her out to the ranch in the wagon under a sky going from gold to deep blue to black, and neither of them said much, because there was too much to say, and the road was the kind that made talking feel small. She watched the country open up around her, the long grass silver in the last light, the butte standing black against the stars, and Caleb watched her watch it. "It's bigger than I thought," she said once. "From the letters I pictured something close. A yard, a fence, not all of this. A man writes small when he's afraid of sounding proud," Caleb said. "I've got near a section now. Cattle on most of it. The house is small but it's tight, and the stove is the best stove in 40 miles, and I'll deny saying that if you tell anyone." The smallest sound came out of her. It took him a moment to understand it was a laugh, a tired and rusty one, the laugh of a woman who had not had a safe reason to laugh in a long while. When they came up the rise and the house showed in the starlight, low and square with the barn behind it, she went still. "You don't have to decide tonight," Caleb said, stopping the wagon. There's a room that was my mother's things before she passed. Clean sheets, a bolt on the inside of the door. You sleep there as long as you need. I sleep in the main room. Nobody's making any promises to anybody until you've had a week of full meals and real sleep and a chance to see what you're saying yes or no to. The marrying can wait. The surviving can't. So we'll do the surviving first. She put her gloved hand over her mouth and her shoulders shook, and Caleb had the sense not to touch her and the sense not to look away. He just let her cry it out under the stars next to the house he had spent 12 years building for exactly this, and never once believing it would come. Word travels fast in a small place, and it travels fastest when it has a woman's reputation to carry. By the end of that first week, Gray Butte had made up its mind about Eleanor Frost, without troubling to meet her. At the Mercantile, conversations stopped when Caleb came in. The Reverend Pell, a thin man with a thin idea of mercy, paid a call to the ranch uninvited and spoke to Caleb on the porch in a low, urgent voice about appearances, about the example a man sets, about how a respectable rancher did not take in a fallen woman and her shame and call it Christian. Caleb let him finish. Then he said, "Reverend, that woman buried a husband at 25 and walked into a town full of strangers, carrying a child and her own 2 hands, and nothing else. I've seen grown men with 1/10 of her trouble lie down and quit. You can call that shame if you want. I'd be careful, though. Whatever you call her, you're calling it loud enough that the Lord can hear which side you picked." The Reverend left. He did not come back, and he did not stop talking, but Caleb found he did not much care. The hardest one was Hattie Combs, who ran the boarding house and had buried 2 husbands of her own, and was, under the vinegar, not a bad woman. She caught Eleanor alone at the dry goods counter and looked her up and down, the belly and the worn dress and the tired eyes. "You know what they're saying about you," Hattie said. It was not a question. "I do. You know what they'll say about that child. Out here it follows them. School, church, all of it." Eleanor's hand went flat over the curve of her belly, the way it did when she was afraid and would not show it. "Then I'll have to be the kind of mother that's worth the trouble of getting through," she said. "And I'll have to hope the child is strong. Most of us are, when we have to be. You buried 2 husbands and you're still standing behind that counter every morning. I'd guess you know something about that." Hattie Combs looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind the vinegar. The next week, a basket of baby things appeared on the Hartwell porch with no note, knitted small and careful, and Caleb did not ask, and Eleanor did not ask, but they both knew old Hattie's stitching when they saw it. The week became 2. 2 became a month. Nobody said the word marriage, and the word sat in the house anyway, patient, the way important words do. Eleanor turned out to be a worse liar than she feared, and a better partner than Caleb had dared imagine. She found the slow leak in the root cellar he had been ignoring for a year. She kept the books in a clean hand and showed him, gently, where the feed merchant had been rounding up against him for 3 seasons. She could not lift a hay bale, not in her condition, but she could run a household with the quiet competence of a woman who had once run one on nothing at all. And she could read. In the evenings, when the work was done and the lamp was lit, she read to him, not because he could not, but because he could not the way she could, smooth and unhurried, the words coming out like they meant something. She read him newspapers 2 weeks old and a novel she had carried all the way from Baltimore, the only thing of value she had not sold. Caleb sat in his father's chair and listened to a voice fill his house, and some nights he forgot to be careful and just let himself be happy, and then caught himself, because happiness had a way of charging interest. One night she stopped mid-sentence and looked at him over the top of the book. "You watch me like you're waiting for me to disappear," she said. "Maybe I am. I'm not going to disappear, Caleb." It was the first time she had used his name without the mister. It landed in the room like a coal dropped on the floor, warm and a little dangerous. "I'm too far along to run, and too tired to want to. Whatever happens with the child, whatever the town does, I'm not the running kind. I tried it once. It only brought me to a platform in Montana with a man who took my bag instead of my dignity." Caleb did not have words for that. He had never been good with words out loud. So, He got up and put another log in the best stove in 40 miles, and he said the only true thing he had, which was, "I'd be glad if you stayed, child and all, especially the child." The storm came in October, 3 weeks too early, the way Montana storms sometimes do, when they want to remind people who is in charge. It came down out of the northwest in the afternoon, gray and fast, and by dark the wind was screaming, and the snow was sideways, and the world had shrunk to the few feet a lamp could reach. Caleb got the cattle to the lee of the south ridge, and the horses into the barn, and himself into the house, with ice in his eyebrows, and a cough he did not like the sound of. And in the deep middle of that storm, 2 months before her time, Eleanor Frost went into labor. It was too early. They both knew it was too early. The nearest doctor was in Gray Butte, 11 miles off through a whiteout that would kill a man and his horse both before they made the 3rd mile. There was no sending for help. There was only the two of them and the wind and the best stove in 40 miles, roaring now, and a child that had decided it was coming, whether the world was ready or not. "Caleb!" Eleanor's voice was tight, with a pain she was trying to ride instead of fight. "I've helped at 3 births. I know what's supposed to happen. I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're going to do it, and you are not going to be sick or afraid where I can see it, because I need your hands steady more than I need your worry. Can you do that?" "I can do that." "Then put more water on." And Caleb, she caught his wrist as a wave of it took her, and held on until it passed. "If it comes to choosing, if something goes wrong and there's a choice to make, you choose the baby. Promise me. There's not going to be a choice. Promise me anyway." He looked at her, this woman who had stepped off a train into the worst day of her life, and lifted her chin anyway, and he understood that he would have promised her the moon and the deed to it. "I promise," he said, and meant the opposite, and they both knew it, and that was its own kind of vow. I will not pretend that night was anything but terrible. The wind did not let up for 9 hours. The lamp guttered, and Caleb refilled it with hands that shook, and then did not shake, because she told them not to. Eleanor labored on the bed that had been his mother's, gripping the iron rail, and between the worst of it, she gave him instructions in a calm, flat voice, the voice of a woman doing the hardest work there is, and refusing to drown in it. There was a long stretch near 3 in the morning when Caleb thought he was going to lose them both. The child was turned wrong. Eleanor's strength was going out of her like water out of a cracked jug, and her lips had gone the color of the snow piling against the window, and the calm in her voice had thinned down to almost nothing. "Talk to me," she whispered. "I can't see straight. Talk to me, Caleb, so I know which way is up." So Caleb talked. He told her about the 12 years. He told her about the watch he sold and the well he dug by hand and the woman in Ohio who chose the banker, and how he had stopped believing the house would ever have anyone in it. He told her that the first letter she sent had sat in his coat pocket for a month because he liked knowing it was there. He told her, in the plain, clumsy words of a man who had never said such things, that the best day of his whole life had been the worst day of hers, the day she stepped off that train, because it was the day his house stopped being a barn he slept in. "So you keep your eyes open," he said, "and you keep working, because I have waited 41 years for you, and I am not losing you to a turned baby and an early snow. Now push when I tell you, and not before." And whether it was the words or the stove, or her own stubborn refusal to die in front of a kind man, the child turned. At 10 minutes past 4 in the morning, by the watch he had bought to replace the one he sold, Eleanor Frost delivered a small, furious, breathing baby girl into Caleb Hartwell's 2 steady hands. She was early, and she was small, and she was loud, which the midwives say is the best sound there is. Eleanor laughed and wept at the same time, gray-faced and alive, and Caleb, holding a child that carried another man's name, found that his face was wet too, and that he did not care in the slightest whose name she carried, because she had been born in his house, into his hands, and that made her his, in every way that counted to him. They named her Grace. It was Eleanor who chose it, and Caleb who agreed before he heard the reason. "Grace is what you give somebody who hasn't earned it," Eleanor said, the baby asleep on her chest in the gray light after the storm finally broke. "That's what you gave me on that platform." I'd like her to carry it where she goes. The snow lay 3 feet deep and blue-white to the horizon, and the world was washed clean and silent, the way it only is after a storm that nearly took everything. Caleb stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and looked at the woman in his mother's bed and the child on her chest, and he thought about the 6 o'clock train he had not put her on, and the section of land, and the best stove in 40 miles, and how close the whole of it had come to staying empty forever. Eleanor, he set the coffee down. I'm not going to ask you the way the advertisement meant it. The advertisement was for a stranger, and we're past that. So I'll just say the true thing, and you can do with it what you want. She watched him, steady. I don't want you to stay because the town would talk if you left. And I don't want you to marry me because a woman with a child needs a name to stand behind. You've got your own name and it's a good one. I want you to stay because some night this winter, you'll read to me by that lamp, and I'll look over at you and Grace and I'll think, that's it. That's the thing I was building for. I just didn't know its face yet. I want to marry you because I like who I am, in a house that has your voice in it. That's all I've got. It's not pretty, but it's every word true. Eleanor Frost, who had prayed on a train platform that this man would be cruel enough to make the choice for her, looked at the man who had refused to, every single time, and let her choose for herself. Caleb Hartwell, she said, I have been waiting 2 months for you to stop being so careful with me. Yes, I'll marry you. And the next time there's a choice to make, you stubborn man, you'll make it together with me, because that's what this is. They were married in April, when the snow went off the low ground and the grass came back green and impossible the way it does out there. It was not the Reverend Pell who married them. It was a circuit preacher passing through, a younger man with kinder eyes, and the witnesses were Hattie Combs in her good dress, and the feed merchant, who had stopped rounding up his bills once Eleanor took over the books. Grace slept through the whole thing in a basket lined with the careful knitting that had appeared on the porch with no note. The town came around, the way towns do, slowly and then all at once. A child has a way of melting a place. By summer, Grace Hartwell was passed from lap to lap at the church socials, and the women who had whispered her mother's name now competed to hold her, and Eleanor accepted it all, with a grace the child had been named for, neither forgetting the whispers nor wasting her life on them. Caleb sold the good calves that fall, and kept the poor ones, same as always. Except now there was a reason to come up the rise, when the day's work was done. There was a lamp in the window. There was a voice reading. There was a small, furious girl who would grow up calling him Pa, and never once asking whether she had a right to, because the man who delivered her into the world with his own 2 hands had decided the question before she could even ask it. I said at the start that Eleanor did not run, that she lifted her chin on that platform and waited to be judged where she stood. Here is what I have come to believe about that. Courage is not the absence of a train you could take back east. Courage is standing on the platform with the fare in your hand and choosing to be seen. Caleb Hartwell waited 12 years for a bride. What stepped off the 410 was not what the letters promised. It was better, and it took him a frozen October night and a child that was not his blood to understand that the thing he had been building all those years was never the ranch at all. It was room. Room in a life for someone else's whole story, lie and grief and all, and the patience to let it become his too. If this one warmed you, stay a while. There are more lamps in more windows out here, and every one of them has a story about someone who stepped off a train with nowhere left to go, and found, against all the odds the world had stacked, that they had finally come